Okay, folks, for those of you who are just joining now, this meeting is being recorded and I'm recording just the presentations, and at the end, if you want to ask Q&A, we'll open it up to comments, and at that point I'll stop the recording. We're going to have two presentations starting shortly. Myself and Joe Moorman from Chwarae Teg, and we'll hear all about their involvement in the project during the course of the presentation. So today we are launching a toolkit that has been developed over a period of two and a half years by ourselves and colleagues from across the 4 nations of the UK. The goal overall is to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace, because although we have laws around sexual harassment in the workplace and have had for a number of decades in some cases, the problem still persists. And one of the reasons it persists is because there is a gap between what's written down on paper and what's actually practiced in workplace culture. And that's what we're trying to bridge with this project. So I'm Elaine Corey from the Women's Resource and Development Agency, and we are one of the 4 partners, the Northern Ireland partner for this project. The other partners, I'm going to introduce now, if I can get this presentation to comply. The other partners are Chwarae Teg, and that's where Joe is from, Fawcett Society, who are based in England. Chwarae Teg are based in Wales, I should say, and their name in English means fair play. And the other partners are Close the Gap from Scotland, and then ourselves in Northern Ireland. And it's funded by Rosa, the UK Fund for Women and Girls, and Time's Up UK. And the advantage of the 4-nation approach can't really be understated, because for a number of reasons, there are different experiences in different parts of the UK, but also each of these organizations has its own different kind of expertise and different kind of ranges of experience and skill sets and so on. So we didn't all do the same thing. It wasn't a partnership approach where everything was simply divided into 4. Different people took on different roles within the partnership. And one of the things that we're going to hear about later on is Chwarae Teg's expertise in training those people within organizations that look after HR, human resources, and policy within workplaces. And some of the training that they have done, that Joe's going to explain in a lot more detail, is really innovative. It's brand new. It's the first of its kind. And all of those training materials and so on form part of the toolkit we're going to hear about later on. So at a glance, what was the project all about? It began with research, because, as I was saying, we understand that sexual harassment in the workplace continues to be a serious problem, and despite all of the laws. So we wanted to look at the reasons why it remains such a problem, and why that is, what's going on with people's understanding of what counts, so to speak, as sexual harassment, and what's going on within workplace cultures that overrides what the law says. So we wanted to understand how employers, managers, and women understand and experience sexual harassment in the workplace. And that obviously, that includes a degree of asking people their experiences and listening to them, taking them on board. But people's experiences will be very different depending on whether they are a person who experienced harassment themselves, whether they are a person who witnessed a colleague be sexually harassed, whether they're a person who was perhaps the person that was reported to, or whether they're the person with ultimate responsibility for the workplace, a director, a manager, something like that, employers basically. So they all have very different experiences. And the research that we did involved primary research. So we sent out surveys to people who would qualify as people who would be reported to. So that is managers, HR managers, depending on what the job title is, it's the person that you would report to if you had an issue. We sent out surveys as well to employers, and we sent out surveys to employees. and we took a range of experiences. And what was really striking about it was overwhelmingly there was a feeling that some of the people at the top of the tree, so to speak, didn't really understand the depth of experience of sexual harassment in the workplace, and didn't always deal with it very well. Oftentimes they believed they were dealing with it well, though. They intended to, they meant to, but they just weren't. And that really highlighted the need for resources to support them learning better how to do it. Those people in the middle, those middle manager type people who often got reported to and then filtered the complaint upwards in the organization, very often they felt like they weren't given enough information to deal with these complaints when they came to their door, and they wanted more. And again, that led to where we went to next. And very often those people who experienced sexual harassment and who reported it found that the outcome was disappointing, or that it wasn't handled brilliantly. And when it was handled brilliantly, those rare occasions, they told us exactly what it was about it that made it work. And that gave us more information for the toolkit. And for many of those people who experienced it, they didn't report it at all. And that was usually influenced by the environment in which they worked, and their sense of how well their employer would deal with it. And that again goes towards workplace culture. So the research really told us things we suspected, and also gave us people's first-hand experiences upon which we could build the toolkit. And then the toolkit, which will be available for download from our website soon, hopefully tomorrow, it's designed to equip employers and managers with the skills that they need to improve their policies and their practices, and to make their workplaces a safer place. And I'll explain in detail what's in the toolkit shortly. So this was the, I suppose, key findings from the research that we did. One of them was at least 40% of women have experienced workplace harassment, and women who are marginalized for various other reasons, such as their race, disability, and so on, they face an increased risk, and different forms of sexual harassment. So sexual harassment perhaps tinged with racism, or Islamophobia, or ableism, or some other form of harassment. So it's usually two things combined, maybe even three or more. 45% of the women in that survey reported experiencing harassment online through sexual messages, cyber harassment, and sexual calls, that is phone calls, that ostensibly were work calls, and carried with them some sort of sexual harassment. And that's really, really telling. And that has actually increased, according to research done elsewhere, not by ourselves, that's increased throughout the course of the pandemic. When so many people were working from home, you would think sexual harassment in the workplace would drop significantly because people aren't in the same room, but it simply found a new outlet. And that tells you again something about the persistence of this problem, and how it keeps, I suppose, morphing to fit the environment that we are now living in. And then almost a quarter of the women who had been sexually harassed said that the harassment had increased or escalated since the start of the pandemic. And, increased or escalated is the opposite of what people expected. And like I say, it indicates the persistence of this problem and how difficult it is to root some of that stuff out. It really renewed the urgency of the toolkit and the importance of everything that's within it. And then almost 7 in 10, that's 68% exactly, disabled women reported being sexually harassed at work, compared to 52% of women in general. So that's that's a remarkable increase. Obviously, disabled women are a smaller minority within a larger group of women, but to see that disproportionate amount tells us something about why harassment occurs in the first place. And one of those things that is pretty obvious is that people are more likely to be victimized in this way when they're perceived as being vulnerable or defenseless. And that tells you something about what needs to be done with workplace cultures and culture across the board, really, about changing people's, I suppose, attitudes towards harassment and what it's okay to get away with. And then ethnic minority workers, both women and men, reported higher rates of sexual harassment than white workers over the last 12 months. That's 32% of ethnic minority workers versus 28% of white workers. And that's in the last 12 months as opposed to over the course of their lifetime. So when you see a difference in the numbers, One of them is, were you ever sexually harassed at work? And the other one is, were you sexually harassed within the last year? So obviously not everybody who was ever sexually harassed will have been within the last year. And then, I actually can't read that bottom statistic, which is quite frustrating, but it's another demonstration that up to 48% of people had experienced some form of harassment in the workplace in their lives. And not all that harassment is sexual harassment, but very often it is, and particularly likely to be so when it's women. So, I mean, those research findings, and like I said, many of them came with testimonies, first-hand testimonies. And in the report, which you can read as part of the toolkit, it uses quotations, sometimes quite long, lengthy ones, that really tell you the experience firsthand, what it was like for that person in that workplace and how often powerless and unsupported they felt in that moment. And it really reiterates the need to do something about workplace cultures, something more than what has often been done. So how did the project developed from the research was, first of all, the research showed us the scale of the problem and the need for a workplace cultural shift. And then there was work with employers, and some of this is providing for them template policies and guides to dealing with workplace harassment. We'll hear more about that in a bit. And the other part was largely done by the pilot training developed by Chwarae Teg. Joe's going to go through that in detail shortly. And then through those two parts of the project, we developed the toolkit. The toolkit contains 12 different elements. I'm going to talk you through them in a moment, but they were also developed in consultation with members of the public through focus groups and learning that we had picked up through stages 1 and 2, the research and the work with employers. So the toolkit was being developed constantly and evolved constantly. We all did, here in Northern Ireland, we did a focus group, and there were focus groups held in England, in Wales and in Scotland as well, to get the feedback from people working in the area on what was there and to improve the content of the toolkit so that it's as good as it can be. So what are the goals of the toolkit? The idea is it is a kit, it's a full kit in and of itself. So it starts with building understanding, and that includes having employers understand and recognize sexual harassment in the workplace. And that means both understanding the dynamic that allows it to happen, so then they can start fixing the culture within the workplace, but also recognizing it when they see it or when it's reported to them. So instead of dismissing something as a bit of banter, a bit of a laugh, or harmless, he doesn't mean any harm, that kind of stuff, they actually recognize it for the problem that it is when it's reported or when they witness it, or indeed when they commit it. The next one is skills. And so there's a number of different things within the toolkit designed to upskill those people to be able to tackle sexual harassment. And that is, for example, how to develop your own standalone sexual harassment policy, how to improve reporting procedures so it's safe for people to report, and various other aspects of the technicalities of putting the infrastructure in place in your workplace. And then ultimately, the overall ideal goal of this project is to ensure that sexual harassment reduces, not just because there are consequences if you get caught or if you get reported, but because the workplace culture is improved, and therefore it's less likely to happen in the first place. So what's in the toolkit? I'm going to give you, there's 12 items in total. I've broken them into 7 subcategories. And then I'm going to hand over to Joe to talk through the training that they developed. So first of all is the report, and that's the report I mentioned before, based on primary research and based on a literature review. It looks at a wide range of surveys and so on that were out there already, and it builds on those with our own primary research. That is a part of the toolkit. It's not a very lengthy report, but it's meaty enough to have a lot of detail. Secondly, it has guides, such as where to start, a guide for employers, and this is for employers who particularly don't really have anything at the moment, or they have a sexual harassment policy that's 1 or 2 lines within an overall workplace conduct policy or something, and it hasn't really been given any thought or care. So it's the guide for how to go about changing that. There are templates as well, including the climate survey template. And the climate survey, the idea there is you are taking the temperature of the workplace to see how common this is, what people's feelings are on the reporting mechanisms, the policy and so on that might be in place already. And the idea of a climate survey is it's not targeted at people who have experienced harassment. It's for every workplace, every person in the workplace in any capacity. And this is an opportunity as well for particularly employees who work within public facing roles to talk about how the workplace deals with things like third party harassment. So whenever a customer might harass a worker in their workplace, and that customer is not subject to the same policy as a fellow employee would be, and how it kind of highlights opportunities for people to talk about other kinds of harassment that take place within the workplace. There's also a template sexual harassment policy and the guidance to go along with that policy. Now, the idea is that's a template. It's not a done thing. You would need to adjust that for your own workplace. And it highlights things like the importance of having more than one person that is the person you report to, just in case that person is the person who's in some way perpetuating the harassment. The fourth thing is campaign materials. Now, the idea is you're trying to change the workplace culture within your workplace. So you want to make it absolutely clear that you have a zero tolerance policy, and therefore you want to run an internal campaign about sexual harassment. So there's a video that was developed, again, mainly by Chwarae Teg, but with input from all of us, that outlines the unacceptability of sexual harassment. There's template posters that you can put your own logo onto and put up around your workplace. There's example campaign posters, and there's a number of different things that you can use to promote this new policy within your workplace and new approach. Then there are case studies, and I've realized I've done a typo in this. One set are employer case studies, and the other are survivor case studies. So these really illustrate lessons employers have learned from dealing with these things, what they may have done wrong, what they may have learned along the journey, what they realize they now need to do going forward. And the other ones are survivor case studies, which make really, really clear the impact that these kinds of things can have on workers who have to go back into a workplace where they're being harassed, what they would like to see done to improve that so it doesn't happen again. And those are really valuable. They aren't always, you can't always lift the lessons and apply them to your workplace straight away, but you can take the overall lesson of why it's so important to do this properly. And then there's support, and these include further support and guidance for employers where they can go to get better resources for their workplace, and helplines for employers when they need legal advice, for example. And when they should go to outside organizations to arbitrate on disputes within the workplace and so on. Everything that they might need is there. And those are separated into 4. So for England, for Wales, for Northern Ireland, for Scotland, so that each employer would know where to go for their relevant information. And the other thing that they contain is the training materials. Now, I'm going to hand over to Jo in a moment so she can explain what those are. But it's about the ASH, that is Anti-Sexual Harassment Pioneer Training Materials that have been developed by Chwarae Teg. And they have been piloted within Wales and are now being rolled out more widely. We're going to hear more about this project now, but Chwarae Teg, I mentioned at the start, it's a Welsh name that means fair play, and they're a women's organisation within Wales who do quite a lot of work with workplaces. So that's one of the reasons why they were the ideal partner to take this part of the training forward. I'm now going to stop my sharing so that Jo Moorman can share hers and talk you through the ASH Champion training. So thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. So bear with me while I try and make this work the way I want it to work. Never be 100% certain it will do what you want. So now, are you able to see my slides?
Not yet, no. Oh. Have you hit share screen, the green button at the bottom? Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
It's coming. It's not quite there. Here we go.
Okay, so what it's done helpfully is taken away from my screen. I've lost control over them, Elaine. So we may have to think about a different way of doing this.
That's still not quite working. Do you want me to share the slides, Joe?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I'm not sure why it's not coming up, but it won't let me do anything with the screen.
Sure,
So,
no problem. I've got this here. So I'm gonna. Oh, let's try that again. Okay, can you all see that? Can anyone see it?
No, Elaine, I think Joe needs to stop sharing the screen.
Okay.
right.
Yeah, it looks like it was frozen on my screen.
I have. Can you eject me, Elaine, from the room and I'll rejoin?
Okay. Sure. Just bear with me.
Thank you.
Okay, that's not working either. Oh, I can't. Oh, I can stop your sharing. That might work. No, that's still not working.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's what.
here we go. Okay, now I'm going to try sharing the screen and showing you all Joe's presentation. Is that working?
Yeah.
Magic. Okay, Joe, you let me know when you want me to move on.
Bear with me 1 second because I can do absolutely nothing. I can't see any of the slides.
Oh no.
Interesting. Okay, so I'll just start and we may have to guess a little bit until hopefully I come back and join you all. But I'm Jo Morman and I'm from Partners. So I spend a lot of my time developing our training resources and working on quality assurance, but I'm also responsible for all of our online learning. So this means that I am brought in on quite a lot of different projects and I work with quite a lot of different employers. So as and when they need me. And this one's been really nice for us because Chwarae Teg, as Elaine says, does a few different things. And we have a research and policy arm. We work directly with women. So one of our biggest projects is something called Agile Nation 2, where we work to increase women's representation in senior positions in the workplace. And we work with employers to improve representation from their end, to try and make workplaces more accessible, more friendly. So we have quite a wide remit, and it's really nice to be able to sort of tackle a problem from multiple directions. So for this, if you're able to move on for me, that would be fab, thank you. So the start of this was the role of the anti-sexual harassment pioneer. So we knew we needed one. And the role of the ASH pioneer is to raise awareness of sexual harassment in the workplace and to drive change within their organisation. We thought that was quite a crucial role, was to say that it's not enough for you to just raise awareness. There has to be a purpose for that, because we know the stats are there. And, you know, Elaine talked to them, I'll probably recap on some in a minute, but the stats alone don't make a change. So for us, if you're happy to move on for me, thank you. In practice, what that means is the ASH pioneers should be prepared to raise awareness throughout their organisation through campaigns, newsletters and presentations, things like that. They should be prepared to deliver, source and advocate for appropriate and comprehensive training for all employees. And again, I'll come back to this later. To be actively involved in reviewing the current situation, the current processes, the practices and the problems faced by an organisation. They should be ready to promote and drive forward culture surveys and the sexual harassment risk assessments. They should be prepared as well then to challenge and provide constructive feedback on what is found and what that situation currently is. And they should be able to interrogate their own privileges and biases to help build a more inclusive culture for all employees. So we've got this concept of an ASH pioneer, but really, why do we need one? Well, the impetus to the programme arose around a few different things. Obviously, we've had the huge Me Too campaign. We have the government July, I think it was 2021, committed to legislation for duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment. And that was following campaigning by the Fawcett Society and other groups off the back of that Me Too movement. And this move recognises that sexual harassment is not just about the aberrant behaviour of a few individuals. I think there's this sort of bad apples notion that keeps coming around. But actually, it's about a culture within workplaces where the everyday behaviour violates the dignity of predominantly women, and it is too often treated as acceptable banter. And this culture is upheld by the way that many employers approach sexual harassment. They can often seek to sort of quietly minimise and resolve incidents after they've happened, minimising liability really. And what we found is this approach is actually an individualised response to what is actually an institutional problem. And it can make things even worse for employees who report sexual harassment, and they can face further victimisation and retaliation. So women often recognise this risk and choose not to report at all. And that leads to this vicious cycle where managers and leaders do not actually know what is happening in their organisations. Some people may be aware of it, some people may not be, but that view of an isolated incident doesn't allow you to create this pattern. And policies then sit on shelves unused. So despite best intentions, many managers don't actually feel equipped to handle cases of sexual harassment. And in environments like this, it holds back employers who want to create that diverse, productive and people-focused organisation and can actually even reduce profits. I know in the training we talked a lot about a moral impetus for doing this. I mean, presumably everyone here knows that this is the right thing to do. We should be tackling this. But trying to convince other people means we also have to recognise there is a business case for tackling this as well. So we do talk about both in the training because they are both important. Unfortunately, we need the business case sometimes to get people on board. So really, there's going to be a regulatory need for employers to shift from this approach that seeks to minimise their liability and to create an organisational culture and norms that prevent sexual harassment in the first place. So where this training sits is part of that toolkit to try and drive that change. So it's to support women to feel safe, primarily women, to support them to feel safe to report incidents, and employers to be confident in responding appropriately. So where that translates to, if I could have the next slide, please, Elaine. So the Fawcett Society, in the overarching report that you can read in the toolkit, there are 5 key actions that came out of all of the research. And they suggested we needed culture change efforts, sexual harassment policies that were fit for purpose, anti-sexual harassment training, which is obviously where this part of the toolkit comes in, more work on the reporting of sexual harassment, and more work around the employer's response to reports to sexual harassment. So if we could move on, please, Elaine. Thank you. So why is the training for the ASH pioneer role important? Well, next slide, please. Again, Elaine has gone through some of these stats, so I won't repeat them all for you, but I think it is really important that we take on how serious this is and how endemic it is to our workplaces when you've got over half of all women, when being young makes you more vulnerable, when being LGBTQ+ or being disabled puts you at greater risk. So for those 7 out of 10 disabled women, they're at greater risk of even covert harassment. So things like visually impaired people being assaulted under the guise of helping them to their seat. And these figures are probably only the tip of the iceberg, and the true figure is probably much more damaging. So, and again, it's also worth knowing that these statistics do not tell us about the sexual orientation or gender identity of the perpetrator. Go to the next slide, please. So again, as Elaine spoke about, home working actually managed to increase risk. And home working is likely to be here to stay, or hybrid working at the very least. So we can't really avoid this. And this is from the rights of women. So it's not just the research for this project that has found this. And if we can move on again, please, Elaine. Thank you. So this is really where some of the other issues started coming in. Despite these worrying statistics, it is still massively underreported. So a survey, I think it was about 1,500 plus workers conducted by YouGov for the TUC found that 79% did not report unwanted sexual behaviour to their employer. And then the Fawcett Society sort of backs this up a little. They found a significant number of women whose report did not report it. The Rights of Women in 2021 found that nearly 1 in 3 women who've reported sexual harassment to their employer said that the process had been negatively impacted by the pandemic as well. And really, if we can't report it, we don't know what problem we're trying to solve. So we need that visibility. So again, here we had 2/3 of our LGBTQ plus respondents didn't report it to their employer. Now, there's a quarter of those who were prevented due to fear of being outed, which I think is our next stat on the slide. And if we go on further, if we consider racialized sexual harassment, that impacts reporting even more. So we here have 7% of white women said they had reported sexual harassment to their employer and it had been dealt with satisfactorily. 7% out of all the people who had been brave enough to report got a satisfactory outcome. Absolutely zero Black, Asian and minority ethnic women who reported that the outcome was satisfactory. So it's not just the sexual harassment, it's the inclusion around it that needs further work. And again, these statistics make it clear that that change is needed, but organisations need support to achieve this. And quotes like this one on the slide, again, these are in the report. So some of the quotes in the case studies in the report are extremely powerful. But often the common thread was that managers felt out of their depth and ill-equipped to deal with such challenging and sensitive disclosures. They didn't know what to do and they didn't know how to do it. So the need for that training and support was clear. And the programme has been built with both the statistics and the findings of the report at its centre. So what we have done is, if you can have the next slide, please, Elaine. Thank you. We've done 3 3-hour sessions, roughly. So they're designed to build on each other. So we start with an introduction to sexual harassment, and we thought this was a really important place to start because we needed to focus on understanding what sexual harassment is and the context in which it occurs. And it was clear again from the report that not everyone knew what it was in the first place, that certain behaviours weren't classed as sexual harassment, so they wouldn't be recorded as sexual harassment. Again, and that might muddy the figures that we're getting through. There might be a lot of people who don't consider themselves to have been sexually harassed because they don't know what constitutes sexual harassment in the first place. And we explore how widespread sexual harassment is. A lot of the statistics that we've gone through are in the presentation because they need to be understood. And consider what could be done just generally at first to explore what could be done to make reporting safer. So this is a very sort of broader sort of conversation because we need everyone to be on the same page before you can work on what needs to be addressed. So we have to have that common language and that common understanding. So in the second session then, we talk about organisational policies. We take that understanding and build it into something. We encourage participants to review their own policies and process in light of good practice recommendations. And then we plan how these changes can be properly embedded and communicated. So we talk about communication plans and how that information needs to be cascaded to different people in different depths, or maybe they need different formats. So we try and consider quite a lot there. There's an inclusivity element that runs through all 3 days. And then in our final session, we talk about building that inclusive culture. And this focuses on ensuring participants understand the crucial role that culture plays in tackling sexual harassment in the workplace and how culture change can actually be achieved. Now, there is a need to round in this for some additional role-specific training for employees to raise awareness of sexual harassment. This is very much, like I say, targeted at those pioneers who will take this forward in their workplace. But they also then need to think about how they ensure managers are confident in receiving reports, conducting investigations, etc. So there might be some work around unconscious bias, empathy, active listening that needs to be done depending on your organisation's needs. And that is partly where things like that culture survey and the risk assessment for sexual harassment that we talk about come into play, because we need to make sure that the scale of the problem is understood, but also everyone understands what an inclusive culture is and the role of power and cultures of silence in allowing sexual harassment to thrive. and how we can address this. So it's not, although we're talking about the pioneer being the one to drive this forward, they can't do this on their own. They have to give the organisation the skills to work together to tackle this. Can I have the next slide, please, Elaine? So although I fully admit that I have been talking to you solidly, the sessions themselves are designed to be as interactive as possible. So while we know that the topics covered can be really challenging, it was really important to us to open up discussions and create this safe space where people could reflect on their own biases, be open about the situation and challenges in their own workplace, think about their organisation's policies critically in order to bring about real change. And these open discussions are also essential in generating new ideas, changing perceptions, and actually learning from each other. Because one thing I really loved about the pilot is we had people from a really broad range of organisations. We had people who worked in sort of counselling capacities. We had people who managed a lot of sort of 0 hours flexible contract workers. We had people from the police, from Ministry of Defence. We had a broad range of people working with us. We had, I think we even had people from Welsh Government. So it was a big spectrum, and we learned a lot from each other. And to support this within the training, I have included a mixture of activities. So we've used polls, we've used interactive whiteboards, we've used breakout rooms, we've used case studies to foster discussion. And all of this out of necessity, because we are in the COVID years, has been designed for online delivery. It would work within a classroom. So we can still run polls, we can use flip charts, we can use breakout areas and small group work. All of these can still happen when we can, or when we want to go back to face, because we wanted to make sure that this resource was flexible to what is likely to be for quite a while a changing situation. So if we can go on, please, thank you. So to take that a step further, we also wanted to make sure the resource was flexible and could be carefully adapted should you need this. And we've also included some suggestions on how to do this within the toolkit. So we've talked about how you might want to adapt the sessions based on, for example, the number of participants, the time, your particular sector or organisation type, where you are. And there's lots of things you can do, and obviously union involvement, which I know is perhaps a more prominent thing in Northern Ireland than it might be with us in Wales, depending on the sector you're in. So we talked about guidance on how you can increase timeframes for longer discussions or for larger group sizes, additional or breaks or planning for longer breaks if you need to support people's well-being, because I think you have to recognise that this topic can be quite triggering or confronting for people as well. So you have to have a little bit of self-care contained in the training. We talked about how to change small group and whole group discussions and vice versa. Again, sometimes that's dictated by your group size, but as we all know, sometimes we have to be flexible based on whether the technology is going to cooperate with you on any one day. So we've tried to sort of scaffold anyone delivering this to give them a little bit of an idea of what can be changed and how, even down to things like changing images or statistics to make them more relevant to your sector, or if you've got particular case studies or examples from your sector you want to build in, there are places they can be slotted in. And also where you might want to, again, talk about more about what union support you can have, whether that is part of your signposting or whether they need to be involved in some of the training themselves. So there's a lot of things that we've put in there to try and support you further. And it's worth having a look through the resources and thinking about what you need from them as well. Can you have the next slide, please, Elaine? So basically all that we've put together will only work if the changes are embraced and supported, and the principles within the toolkit and the training need to be cascaded throughout the whole organisation. So we also talk a bit about how to embed and take this forward. It has to be part of a wider programme of change. And that training for the Ash Pioneers really for us is just the start. So what we need, following the training for the Ash Pioneers, we advise investigation, use those culture surveys, anonymously potentially, find out what the situation is and review potential risks by completing a risk assessment for sexual harassment. Again, I think these templates are in the toolkit. And then again, not just enough to do these, you have to act on the results. So we encourage anyone who engages with this toolkit to make changes to their policy and their processes, improving, diversifying reporting routes, and working towards those necessary culture changes. We encourage throughout the day, throughout each session, for people to set actions at the end of it that they take away and commit to doing something that they report back at the next session. So they get into the habit of actually working on this as a topic. And then we suggest that there is appropriate and specific training for all employees. And this is from your trustees, your board, your senior management, right down to your even volunteers. Everyone involved in your organisation needs to know what this is, and it'll differ based on their role. So to me, everyone would need that basic introduction to what sexual harassment is and the organisation's policy and procedure. But obviously then those who are involved in investigations or receiving reports would need more detailed instruction to fulfil their roles and those specific skills areas I mentioned earlier. And also an important thing is to consider when you conduct the training. So for me, I would suggest all staff are given introductory training. So everyone, again, starts with that same understanding I talked about earlier and the language when inputting into discussions. But you might then think, okay, everyone has had that initial training, but then they need specific training on the policy separately. And you might have to think about the how of doing that with hybrid workers or shift workers. So there is a lot to sort of consider. And it's not just a one and done exercise, which I think sometimes people think, well, we'll have a bit of compliance training and then we can ignore it for a year until compliance training comes around again. But it should be part of the organisation's onboarding process. It should start with your induction. It should be revisited not only when changes occur, but as part of that ongoing cycle of training. And considering the learning campaigns, especially with those imminent changes around third-party harassment as well that are coming through from a recent government review. So again, ACAS guidance is really good to keep that on your radar. And your culture surveys and your risk assessments, they're not one-off activities either. So they'll need to be repeated at intervals to ensure that sexual harassment remains a key topic and that you are continually driving forward that change and addressing new issues as they occur. And I think, you know, all of the organisations that have been involved in the toolkit are here to help and support with that if needed. I'm sure Elaine can talk a bit more about what can be offered by yourselves. But thank you ever so much for listening to me. And obviously, if anyone has any questions or anything, I'm more than happy to answer them, because I agree that I've probably whizzed you through that rather rapidly.
Thanks so much, Jo. And just to add to everyone, Jo does have to leave at 2. The rest of us can stay on a little longer if needed, but perhaps we'll be finished by then because we now have 15 minutes for questions and answers. I'm going to stop recording and then I am going to open up the floor for questions.